expect next year when you
Well,
all
the first step is to get them all released. That will be our first job. And then, once we have the releases, obviously, it's going to be clear as could be to the American people what has gone on here. But, you know, Democrats will be actively involved, letting people know how disgraceful this has been.
The American people should see.
Listen carefully to what we just heard from this senator, because underneath the measured words and practiced political cadence lies something absolutely catastrophic about the relationship between power and accountability in this republic. And I need you to understand this before the news cycle moves on to some other distraction manufactured to keep us complacent while the architecture of elite immunity gets reinforced with every single moment that passes without these revelations seeing daylight. Congress voted overwhelmingly to pass legislation to compel the Justice Department to release its records related to the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, and what we're witnessing right now is the entire political establishment scrambling to control exactly what narrative emerges from files that should have been released years ago, files that contain evidence of systematic abuse enabled by wealth and political connections, so profound that the mere prospect of their disclosure has created a bipartisan frenzy unlike anything we've seen in this divided moment. This senator promises transparency with one hand, while holding the power to determine what transparency actually means with the other. And if you think that's a contradiction, wait until you grasp the full scope of what's actually happening here, because what we're seeing is not accountability, but the theater of accountability. The performance of justice designed to satisfy public outrage while protecting the fundamental structure that allows men with money and power to operate above the law. The Epstein Files Transparency Act requires the United States Attorney General to make publicly available in a searchable and downloadable format all files pertaining to the prosecution of the deceased child sex offender Jeffrey Epstein within 30 days of passage, and that deadline is tomorrow, December 19th, which means we're about to find out whether the promise of exposure was genuine or merely another mechanism of delay and obfuscation in a system that has spent decades protecting predators who happen to collect the right phone numbers and donor lists. The senator says Democrats will be actively involved, letting people know how disgraceful this has been, and that phrasing alone should send chills down your spine, because what exactly has been disgraceful here beyond the initial crimes themselves? The cover-up, obviously, but also the institutional complicity, the decades of looking away, the non-prosecution agreements that let a serial predator continue his crimes with barely a slap on the wrist, the networks of enablers in finance and law and politics who facilitated or ignored or benefited from Epstein's operation. The Trump administration's Justice Department released a memo stating the list did not exist, and no credible evidence was found that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals, and just months later, the same administration reversed course under such immense pressure that several Epstein survivors sitting in the gallery embraced one another and loud cheers went up through the chamber when the bill finally passed, which tells you everything about how hard the political class fought to prevent this moment from arriving. And here's where it gets genuinely terrifying, because you need to understand what's at stake when we talk about elite impunity, when we discuss the gap between the accountability faced by ordinary people and the accountability faced by those with access to power and capital, and the lawyers who know how to navigate every loophole built into a system designed to protect property and privilege above human dignity. The culture of elite impunity that Trump symbolizes must be brought to an end, but Trump is merely the most garish symptom of a disease that runs through both parties, through corporate boardrooms and judicial chambers, through the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington, where financial crimes that destroy millions of lives result in settlements paid by shareholders while executives collect bonuses, where during the 1980s savings and loan scandal, over 1,000 bankers went to prison, but in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, only one banker went to prison, and no one was held accountable for the housing collapse that devastated working families across America. The Epstein case crystallizes everything wrong with how power operates in the contemporary United States, because here we have documented evidence of systematic trafficking and abuse involving high-profile figures across politics and finance and academia. We have flight logs and communications and witness testimony. We have a dead predator and a convicted accomplice serving 20 years. And yet somehow the institutional response has been to fight the release of information tooth and nail, to claim that no client list exists despite Attorney General Pam Bondi saying in February that Epstein's rumored client list was sitting on her desk right now to review an influencers receiving binders labeled the Epstein Files Phase 1 at the White House. Before the administration suddenly declared, Trump defended Bondi and referred to Epstein as somebody that nobody cares about, and called the Epstein files a big hoax, in what can only be described as a masterclass in gaslighting the public about their right to know what their government knows about crimes committed by the powerful against the vulnerable. What does it mean when Congress has to force the Justice Department to release documents about one of the most notorious criminal conspiracies of our era? When Trump and other Republicans launched a pressure campaign to prevent the release of the files, with one anonymous official calling voting for the discharge petition a very hostile act to the administration. It means that those files contain information someone desperately wants hidden, information that implicates not just Epstein's known associates but potentially exposes the mechanisms through which elite networks protect their own. The phone calls made to prosecutors, the pressure applied to judges, the media connections leveraged to kill stories, the financial arrangements that keep victims silent through non-disclosure agreements backed by the threat of endless litigation against anyone who dares to speak. And here's what infuriates me about the senator's measured tone and promises of revelation, because we've been down this road before with every scandal that threatened to expose the corrupt heart of elite power structures, from Iran-Contra to the Iraq War, lies to the financial crisis to the torture program. We get promises of accountability followed by limited hangouts and carefully curated releases and investigations that focus on process failures rather than the people who design the processes to fail. Such withholding might well be normal, but here I worry that it will be used as a cover for a selectivity that helps Trump and his friends and hurts those he considers his enemies, and that's precisely what we should expect when the administration has already ordered investigations specifically targeting Democratic figures, while documents in ongoing investigation areas can't be released. So this might be a big smokescreen to open a bunch of investigations as a last-ditch effort to prevent the release of the Epstein files. The timeline here is absolutely crucial to understanding the bad faith at work, because Trump stated in a September 2024 interview he would have no problem releasing additional Epstein files and would probably make the client list public, but once in power the tune changed dramatically until Representative Thomas Massie filed a discharge petition in September 2025 that required 21-8 signatures from 4 Republican representatives and 214 Democratic Party representatives to force a vote that the administration had been desperately trying to prevent, and the fact that it took a near-unanimous bipartisan revolt to compel transparency about crimes everyone agrees were monstrous tells you exactly how invested the political establishment is in maintaining the wall of silence around elite criminality. We need to talk about what elite impunity actually means in concrete terms, because this isn't some abstract academic concept. This is the lived reality of a system where political and economic elites exploit the weakness of the system, using procurement fraud and bribery, and the absence of effective measures promotes human rights violations and increases the influence of economic and political elites, fostering impunity and weakening countries' capacity to address climate change with dramatic consequences for population. Every dollar stolen through corruption is a hospital without medicine, a school without teachers, a road that crumbles, a climate crisis unaddressed because those with power prioritize profit over survival. And the Epstein case is the perfect embodiment of this principle, because his wealth bought him a non-prosecution agreement in 2008 that let him continue trafficking girls for another decade, while prosecutors looked away. And listen to the philosophical implications here, because what we're really discussing is whether we live in a nation governed by laws or by the arbitrary whims of those who can afford the best lawyers and have the right connections in the right offices. Whether the Enlightenment ideal that no person stands above the law was ever anything more than propaganda designed to legitimate a system that has always functioned primarily to protect property and privilege. Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil, about how ordinary people become complicit in atrocity through bureaucratic distance and the following of orders, and the Epstein network represents the banality of elite impunity where everyone involved could claim they were just doing their job, just following procedure, just protecting sources and methods and ongoing investigations, while girls were being trafficked and abused by men who knew the system would protect them. The senator promises that once the releases happen, it will be clear as could be to the American people what has gone on here, and I desperately want to believe that, but history suggests otherwise because the first batch of documents unsealed in January 2024 didn't appear to contain any bombshell revelations, and much of the information in them has already been released through media reports and other court proceeding, which raises the question of whether we're about to get the full truth, or a sanitized version designed to satisfy public curiosity while protecting the most damaging connections and the institutional failures that enabled them. The Department of Justice's unreleased Epstein documents consist of nearly 100,000 pages, as well as 40 computers, 70 CDs, 26 storage drives, and 6 recording devices containing a collective 300 gigabytes of data, and physical evidence includes photographs, travel logs, employee lists, blueprints of Epstein's island and Manhattan home, a logbook of visitors to Epstein's private island, and a list of names. So the question becomes whether all of that sees daylight, or whether we get a carefully curated subset. The power dynamics here are absolutely critical, because the DOJ is permitted to withhold certain information, such as the personal information of victims and materials that would jeopardize an active federal investigation. And while protecting victims is obviously necessary and laudable, that exception creates an enormous loophole through which accountability can be made to disappear, especially when the bill includes a carve-out for records that would jeopardize an active federal investigation or ongoing prosecution. And the administration has conveniently assigned Manhattan U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton to investigate Epstein's ties to several of the president's perceived foes, in what looks suspiciously like a mechanism for selective disclosure and selective protection. And we need to connect this to the broader crisis of institutional legitimacy, because we're not far from the bottom in terms of public trust in governmental institutions, and public acceptance of an institution as legitimate can only survive the death of its integrity by so long. And every time the system fails to hold the powerful accountable, every time justice gets delayed or denied or redirected toward convenient scapegoats, while the architects of harm walk free, that legitimacy erodes further, until we reach a point where vast swaths of the population simply stop believing that the rule of law means anything beyond the rule of whoever has enough money to hire the right lawyers and make the right donations. The class analysis here cannot be avoided, because what we're witnessing is the fundamental contradiction of capitalism in its late imperial stage, where wealth concentration has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, where the Americas must urgently address impunity and protect civic space, and take measures to curb the influence of organized crime and elites in politics. And the Epstein network existed at the intersection of finance capital, political power, and the impunity that comes from being too connected to prosecute, without bringing down networks that span both parties and multiple nations. This wasn't some isolated predator, but a node in systems of power that facilitate the exploitation of the vulnerable by the wealthy. And releasing the files means potentially exposing how those systems function, which is precisely why the resistance to release has been so fierce. Think about what it means that the overwhelming bipartisan votes came after President Donald Trump reversed course and encouraged Republicans to support the measure he had previously opposed, that the bill only passed because it went from appearing dead in the water to heading toward the president's desk, and just 4 days earlier, Trump posted that the Democrats are doing everything in their withering power to push the Epstein hoax again, and said some weak Republicans have fallen into their clutches before political pressure made opposition untenable. That reversal tells you everything about how these decisions get made, how power calculates risk and exposure, how the political class circles the wagons until public pressure becomes too intense to ignore, and even then they're looking for ways to control the narrative and protect the most damaging connections. I want you to understand the cynicism required to watch this unfold and maintain faith in institutional processes, because the senator's assurances mean nothing if the administration can hide behind ongoing investigation exceptions, if critical names get redacted for national security reasons that are really about political security, if the most damaging documents somehow never make it into the public releases because they're too classified or too sensitive or would jeopardize unnamed sources and methods. We've seen this movie before with every scandal that threatened the powerful, from the JFK assassination files that remain partially sealed decades later, to the torture program, where the torturers walk free while the person who exposed the program faces prosecution, to the drone program, where we're not allowed to know who we're killing or why, but we're assured it's all legal and necessary. The moral clarity here should be overwhelming, because we're talking about the systematic sexual abuse of children by wealthy men who believed their money and connections placed them above accountability, and yet somehow the conversation has become about process and procedure, about protecting ongoing investigations and national security, and the privacy rights of people who aren't the victims, but the perpetrators and their networks of enablers. When one of the 9 most powerful judges in the U.S. has routinely accepted secret private jet rides and luxury yacht vacations from a billionaire right-wing mega-donor for over 2 decades in violation of the Ethics in Government Act, if the ruling class wants the public to believe that the rule of law means anything, then the answer must be breaking the law, necessitating investigations and trials and professional consequences. From the same principle applies here, where documented crimes and documented cover-ups should result in prosecutions, not carefully managed releases, designed to minimize political fallout. And here's where we need to talk about the progressive imperative, because if we're serious about building a more just society, if we genuinely believe that another world is possible beyond the brutal hierarchies of capital and the impunity of wealth, then we cannot allow this moment to pass with some limited document dump followed by a media circus that focuses on individual salacious details while ignoring the systemic failures that made the entire Epstein network possible. We need to demand not just transparency about who did what, but investigations into how the system protected them, prosecutions of every prosecutor and law enforcement official who looked away or was pressured to look away, legislation that makes it impossible for wealth to buy immunity through settlements and sealed court records and non-prosecution agreements. The senator says the American people should see everything they see, and that's the bare minimum, but it's not enough, because seeing is not the same as justice. Transparency without accountability is just voyeurism, and we've had enough revelations followed by outrage followed by nothing, while the same structures that enabled Epstein continue enabling whoever comes next. Corruption is widespread because the corrupt continue to get away with it, and if there was no impunity, there would be less corruption. And breaking that cycle requires not just releasing documents, but dismantling the legal and political architecture that creates two systems of justice, one for those who can afford it, and one for everyone else. What keeps me up at night about this case is the knowledge that right now, today, there are other networks operating with similar impunity, other predators protected by wealth and connections, other prosecutors being pressured to look away, other victims being silenced through legal threats and settlements, and the Epstein files might expose some of what happened, but they won't necessarily change the conditions that made it possible unless we force that change through sustained political pressure and radical reform. The discharge petition succeeded because Democrats alongside Nancy Mace, Lauren Boebert, and Marjorie Taylor Greene signed it, which shows that public demand for transparency can overcome partisan division, but that same public pressure needs to be sustained and amplified after the files drop to ensure they lead somewhere beyond another news cycle. The historical parallel here runs through every moment of elite corruption that threatened to expose the rot at the heart of power, from the Gilded Age trusts, through Watergate, through Iran-Contra, through the financial crisis, and what we've learned is that the system has remarkable capacity to absorb revelations through mechanisms of limited exposure and scapegoating, and reform theater that changes nothing fundamental about power distribution. Michel Foucault wrote about how power operates through institutions and discourse, how it creates the categories and procedures through which we understand justice and accountability, and the Epstein case demonstrates perfectly how those mechanisms function to protect elite networks through the very processes supposedly designed to expose them. Listen to what the senator isn't saying, because that silence is as revealing as the promises. He's not talking about prosecutions of enablers, not discussing the non-prosecution agreement that let Epstein walk in 2008, not addressing how the system itself needs restructuring to prevent this from happening again, just promising that documents will be released and everything will be clear, as if clarity alone constitutes justice in a system where we've had clarity about elite criminality for years, and yet somehow the criminals remain largely untouched. The concept of too big to fail functions as a cover for the impunity conferred to financial elites in cases involving transnational organized crime, as illustrated by the HSBC Bank case, where no entity or person suffered a federal conviction for extensive criminal conduct for banking violations that facilitated money laundering by Mexican and Colombian drug trafficking organization, and the same principle applies here where certain people are too connected to prosecute without destabilizing the networks through which elite power operates. Tomorrow is the deadline for release, and we're about to find out whether the Epstein Files Transparency Act delivers actual transparency or becomes another mechanism through which the appearance of accountability substitutes for the reality. Another moment where we're told to trust the process while the process protects those it was supposedly designed to expose. The survivors who cheered in the gallery when the bill passed deserve more than documents. They deserve prosecutions. They deserve systemic change. They deserve a world where what happened to them becomes impossible, because we've dismantled the structures of impunity that made it possible in the first place. And this connects to every struggle for justice, because the mechanisms that protected Epstein are the same mechanisms that protect police who murder with impunity, that protect corporations who poison communities, that protect politicians who start wars based on lies, that protect financiers who crash the economy and walk away wealthy while millions lose everything. It's all the same system of elite accountability avoidance through legal complexity and political connections and media management, and the strategic deployment of institutional procedure, and breaking that system requires understanding how it functions, not just in this case but across every domain where power operates to protect itself from consequences. The senator promises Democrats will let people know how disgraceful this has been, and I'm genuinely curious what that means, because if they're serious about that commitment, It should mean investigations, hearings, legislation, prosecutions, not just press releases and cable news appearances. It should mean examining every Justice Department official who slow-walked this investigation, every prosecutor who granted immunity, every judge who sealed records, every lawmaker who blocked oversight, and it should mean structural reforms that make this kind of elite protection racket impossible going forward. But I suspect what we'll actually get is some carefully managed outrage that doesn't threaten anyone currently in power. The urgency here cannot be overstated, because every day that passes without full disclosure and accountability is another day that victims are denied justice, another day that enablers remain free to enable, another day that the message goes out to anyone with enough money and connections that they can get away with anything as long as they're careful about who they know and what lawyers they hire. The Epstein case should be a watershed moment that transforms how we think about elite accountability in America, that finally forces a reckoning with the reality that we have two systems of justice operating simultaneously, that catalyzes reforms making it impossible for wealth to purchase immunity, but whether it becomes that depends entirely on whether we demand it and sustain that demand beyond the initial revelations. What I need you to take from this clip and this moment is that transparency is necessary but insufficient, that seeing the files matters, but only if it leads to action, that outrage is justified but meaningless unless channeled into sustained political pressure for systemic change, and that the fight for justice in the Epstein case is inseparable from every other fight against elite impunity, whether that's police violence or environmental destruction or financial fraud or imperial warfare, because they're all manifestations of the same fundamental problem, which is that power protects itself through institutions that claim to serve justice while actually serving power. The deadline is tomorrow, the files should be released, and then the real work begins of making sure this time is different, this time leads somewhere, this time the system doesn't absorb and neutralize and redirect the revelations into channels that change nothing about who has power and who faces consequences, and whether we're actually a nation of laws, or just a nation where laws apply differently depending on how much money you have and who you know, and whether the system decides you're worth protecting,